My favorite thing was learning that I read differently than kindergartners as an adult. That was fun in college at Yale. Today I'm going to talk about what it's like to be neurodivergent with learning disabilities and interact and function in corporate America. For context, if you don't know who I am, my name's Sade. I talk about finance and financial careers here on YouTube, and I post freely on TikTok if you want to go follow me. And so I guess the thing that I now have to say is, like, feel free to subscribe or like the video. That all really helps me and I really appreciate it. But overall today, I really wanted to sit down and talk about what it was like to function in corporate America at a high level with some pretty severe neurodivergence and learning disabilities. I also want to say that I've always been seen as someone who functions at a very high level. I'm not someone who really likes functioning labels in general, but I do think that's important, is that I've been able to function in these spaces since I was little, even though these things have always played a role in how I interact. So I'm someone who's been diagnosed as neurodivergent for a very long time, and the way that that has interacted has often changed. Originally, why I functioned differently stemmed from what we saw as mental health issues, so anxiety and depression at a pretty severe level. And what's been cool as I've become an adult and have been able to advocate for myself better in mental health situations is new diagnoses that seem to fit my experience better. Basically what it boils down to right now is that I've got pretty severe learning disabilities and just differences in cognitive abilities. And so what that looks like for me in pure diagnostic terms is a diagnosis of ADHD, dyslexia, aphantasia, and symptoms of or mild autism, depending on what professional you speak to. I also want to say that I don't always identify with all of those diagnoses in the way that they have been stated by mental health professionals, but I do think it's important to put out kind of what clinically my charts look like at the moment. And in response, here are some areas that are really hard for me that come into play in corporate America. I have a hard time with time management and like executive functioning sometimes. I have difficulty staying organized. I have difficulty catching things while I read. Quick side note though is that I'm a very good reader and I read a lot. I just read very differently. Maybe I'll even throw in some quotes from my more recent cognitive ability tests. If I do, some sound bites will be right here. Also on my own, I procrastinate, and then in the social sphere, I definitely have a harder time reading certain social cues and interactions. I have a harder time with emotion regulation, and just other kind of social interactions can be hard for me. On this note, I really loved remote work. Working from home has been something that's been really beneficial for me. I've been able to work on my own time and in my own space, and that's been really helpful in terms of curbing a lot of the difficulties I've had, though it does open up this area where I can procrastinate more if things aren't laid out as explicitly as I would like or need them to be. I also just want to say quickly before I jump into this that if you're neurodivergent or you're here because you feel like you function in a way that's different from your peers, that's okay. It doesn't make you any less smart or any less legitimate. And I just want to say that I recognize it's really, really hard to function in a world that doesn't always cater to you or feel like you have a place in, and that's not your fault. That's the fault of the world around you, and you can still function in these spaces. It just takes more work and different levels of engagement. And I don't really think there's a great ending to that other than saying, please be gentle and kind with yourself, and these things take time and energy, and I'm sure you're doing all right. But with that, let's jump into my 10 tips for working in corporate America while being neurodivergent. Number 1 is to let people know. I've found that it's easier to have these conversations up front so people know where my limitations are before jumping into them. Not everything needs to be a huge thing. Maybe just like, hey, here's something I have trouble with. Please feel free to let me know if there's any difficulties or you have problem with my work in this space. It's a lot easier to have those discussions before you're getting feedback rather than after. If you're not comfortable talking to your manager, it's always okay to go to a place like HR, especially if you need accommodations, which are completely fine and legitimate to ask for. The second thing is write everything down. Writing everything down in corporate America has been the biggest godsend ever. I've mentioned this before, but I write everything in little notebooks and then read through them at the end of the day or end of the week. I also write down what happens in conversations that I find important, and to timestamp them, I often email them to myself. Obviously, that's not both sides of everything, but something I've just found really helpful in these spaces is to just document as much as I can and make sure that I have resources to refer to later, especially knowing that I can be frazzled or my memory can be flawed. And my little 2.5 here is Post-it notes are my absolute best friend. When I worked on a desk, I had Post-it notes everywhere. I put them on my computer, I put them on my desk, I would tape them down with codes I needed and stuff like that. If you can't remember something, it's just always easier to write it down and refer to it later, as long as you're not like breaking any proprietary or privacy things. Number 3 is that I use a to-do list. I am tied to my to-do lists, and I know people use to-do lists differently, so here's how I do it. In the morning, I sit at my desk and I write down everything I need to do that day that I can possibly think of. That includes longer term tasks and shorter term tasks, and then I break out the longer ones kind of bit by bit. And as the day goes on, if I come up with other things or think of tasks that need to be done, I just add them to this list. It's literally just a running list of every single thing that I need to get done. And then after I've written out all of my tasks that I can think of, I highlight and star them based on what I think I need to get done that day and what tasks I know can be done in under 10 minutes. I'll show you an example of what a list like that looks like here. I also do this for other tasks. When I'm in school, for example, I used to write out every assignment that I had for the whole semester and then sort them by the date they were due. I can show you an example of that now because I'm actually currently in school. And this to-do list isn't stagnant. You can add stuff to it. I add any task that I think of during the day, and at the end of the day, I sit down and I look at what tasks didn't get done, and I migrate that to a new list that starts tomorrow morning. I just think as someone who knows that they're not always good at getting every task done that they need to get done, having to-do lists, having lists you can refer to, both for the short and long term, are really, really, really helpful. Number 4 ties into number 3, but it's that I use my email inbox like a to-do list. I think my first job, I really maximized folders really well. I had folders for all sorts of different tasks and workflows. Some of them get like filtered automatically, and then I would have folders for every single client. So by last name, if a client had a request or I needed to go back and look for something that a client had asked for previously, I would have had folders for each individual client to make sure I managed that relationship individually. And that meant that everything in my inbox that was unread, I was actively working on or needed a follow-up. So when things were done, you could immediately bump them into the folders that they needed to be in. And it was pretty easy to look at my inbox and see how much work I had left to do for the day or the week or whatever. It just means you have to stay on top of your email sorting, which is something that I think has been really helpful for managing ongoing requests from other people. The 5th thing for me is taking time off a desk. In a non-COVID environment, what this meant for me was making sure I took a 5-minute break every hour. I do that by either getting coffee or tea. At Goldman, we could just walk around the floor and grab like free hot water and tea bags. And I know in COVID it's a little bit different because I'm someone who's very conscious of my like little status button switching to away. But I do make sure that I grab some breaks, I take some walks and stuff like that, and know that I'm prioritizing that time so that I can be a more effective worker. My other thing in this is that I like volunteering for moving tasks. So if someone needs something moved from point A to point B, I'm almost always going to volunteer as a way to get off my desk and stimulate brain flow or like pump your legs or whatever you want to say. I will take any moving task. You need me to go grab that check from 3 floors down? I got you. You need me to run to Midtown to grab this original stock certificate? I am on my way. Like any task that allowed me to move and still be productive, especially in an environment where you're primarily sitting, I will always take. Number 6 was finding a workspace. Right now, finance really likes this open floor concept where you sit on a desk surrounded by your peers and everyone can see your computer screen, which is totally fine. It just feels weird for me sometimes. Something I did and liked about Goldman was being able to step into conference rooms, or we had these little glass offices that were available to anybody. And the more I could step into spaces and build my own environment and not be in a place where I was so accessible for distractions was helpful for me. I get very distracted very easily, and having a space that feels just work focused without people popping in and out all the time was really, really helpful. In COVID, I've actually built out my own office space because it was getting so hard to have my like living and workspaces conflated. But finding spaces where focus is easier to do is something that I've found really helpful to deal with things like ADHD in corporate America. The 7th is a big reason of why I've left my last job, but it's making sure that you're asking for feedback and getting feedback that's helpful and appropriate. I know managers don't always like to give feedback, especially if they feel like it's going to be too harsh or if they don't feel like they've got enough stuff to correct you on. But personally, if I'm not getting feedback or deadlines from managers, that makes a workplace really hard because I don't know what people are looking for and I don't always have the ability to read that from others. This becomes double in COVID where you don't actually ever see behaviors. Things aren't really being modeled for you in the same way. There's no like, oh, let me pop over and just see what you're doing. I think that if your manager is not able to provide you with feedback and deadlines and things that they require for you to be successful in your role, it's always going to be harder to do that. I don't like nebulous projects with no deadlines. I procrastinate. I have a hard time just like inferring when people actually want it. So I'll be very upfront with someone being like, oh, here's a project. And I'll come back with, oh, great, like when do you need this by? When would you like a draft by? And stuff like that. So I have a deadline to work to at least. And if things aren't feasible in that regard, I think it's always better to ask in advance and tell someone that their deadline isn't reasonable. Number 8 is addressing boredom. I get really bored at work, especially if and when things aren't interesting and challenging. And I picked finance for a lot of reasons because I thought it was going to be continually interesting and challenging. And fun fact, actually it's not. Most office jobs will have moments of lulls and moments that aren't stimulating, and finding ways to address that boredom is important. For me, I took on learning experiences. I started studying for my CFA, and I found other things that I could do on the desk that were directly tied to work but provided me with some stimulation. And there's a lot of like typical boredom addressing things and hacks that people talk about for people with ADHD. Things like breaking up tasks or like setting little internal deadlines for yourself are always helpful ways to like break up boredom and make things feel less boring. But I think what's been really the most helpful for me is just finding work or other things or other projects that don't make you bored. And number 9 for me, kind of on the flip side of that, was avoiding hyperfocus. I'm someone who hyperfixates and can get really into topics, and while like a Wikipedia deep dive of what too big to fail means is fine like during a slow work day, it's not fine during another time. And sometimes I would have harder times prioritizing like which project should I go first, and I would start one and hyperfocus. And so something I've always done for this was setting calendar reminders. I'll block out my whole calendar hour to hour with tasks that I want to do. I'll show you an example now. And then scheduling things like meetings and coffee chats to break up your day gives you a really nice natural time to reset and reevaluate and check your to-do list. I think the biggest like takeaway from the past 2 is know what traps you'll fall into in terms of your work product, especially as you're entering workplaces that expect work to be done in a uniform way. And just being very aware of the pitfalls of your own thinking and your own practices are really important. And the last thing that I wanted to mention, which is something that I think isn't always considered on these like productivity lists or like how to work with neurodivergence in corporate America, is consider medication. And if you're someone who doesn't struggle with this to an extreme level, obviously this isn't for you. But if you are someone who falls into these pitfalls and doesn't have a way to manage them and hasn't historically, I think that medication is something to at least consider or speak to a professional about. Obviously, this is not self-medication. This is, working with a professional to be treated in a way that's applicable to your specific situation. But I think medication to help yourself function better is something that's often frowned upon or looked down upon by others. And I just want to say that that's not true. If you need medication to function in a way that you feel like is best for you, that is a personal choice that is perfectly legitimate and perfectly okay in the workplace. I'm thinking of that clip in The Office where Nellie and Dwight find that pill and go down this like search for, okay, I'm gonna stop now. I just want to be very cognizant of saying that medication isn't the be-all end-all to fix a lot of situations. It's not the only tool and trick to rely upon, but I do think that sometimes we demonize medication when it could be very helpful for certain individuals. Also, medication doesn't have to just be a quick fix. It's not just to like get you better. There are medications that can help you function over the long term. And I just want to say that if you're thinking about medication or you're on medication or you feel like it could be helpful, that's a really legitimate way to get help to function in a world that wasn't always built for you. But with that, I hope this was helpful. I hope this was helpful as you personally think about what accommodations look like in the workplace, if you need them for yourself, if you are giving them to others. Just know that those are all really legitimate things to ask for to be able to function as your best self. But with that, feel free to share this video if you found it helpful or you think someone else will find it helpful. Other than that, feel free to comment and subscribe. If you hated this video, feel free to leave a snarky comment down below and I'll try to come up with something funny in response. But other than that, thank you so much for tuning in and I will see you guys next week.